we are talking about a man who may have 4 names, but he goes by one, Michelangelo. And he's likely most known for his painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, completed in 1512. But Michelangelo would rather be known for his sculpture work, including his sculpture of David, which he finished in 1505, or even his sculpture of Moses, which is the centerpiece of the tomb of Pope Julius II, located in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli, which is in Rome. And for 40 years, with many interruptions, Michelangelo worked on 40 different statues it was supposed to complete this tomb, and yet it didn't happen. It didn't get to happen in the 5 years that it was supposed to be completed. It didn't happen in the 40 years. But the Moses was completed in 1515, and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and to me, this sculpture, like the David, which is perhaps more famous. Show the picture, Mike. This statue, to me, it is, if you had one picture outside of Michelangelo's David to talk about what the Renaissance actually was, it would be this picture, it seems to me. And as we know, Michelangelo really didn't like painting. As a young boy, he just despised it, which is ironic, of course, because it was this Pope Julius, who initially forced Michelangelo to get up on that scaffold way at the top of the Sistine Chapel and do all of that painting on his back. With all of that paint falling back into his beard and his hair. But it was a sculpture. It was a sculptor, that sculpture that Michelangelo absolutely asserted as his primary gift. And there has been, not since the time of the ancients, right? There has been no sculptor like Michelangelo in the history of Western culture. And so go to the statue of Moses again. Why do I think this is a summary statement about what the Renaissance is? First of all, take a look at Michelangelo's Moses. Note how absolutely brilliant the sculpture is. Notice how the muscles, the veins and muscles of that left arm as it comes across the lap. Notice how the beard, the absolute intricacy of the locks of the beard. You can see the musculature of the man underneath his tunic there, his cloak. And the intensity of the image, right? So this is classical Greek sculpture. No one for about 2,000 years had been able to sculpt bodies this way. Notice the familiarity with anatomy. We know for a fact that Michelangelo used to beg bodies of the local churches, dead bodies, and he would take them back to his room and dissect them. And he would dissect them sometimes in his own bedroom. And we have actually reports of police actions, right, where people went to the cops and complained that there was a stench coming from Michelangelo's room. And of course, that was because he'd bring corpses back and he wouldn't quite finish the job in time. And so they didn't have refrigerators back then. But it was this study of anatomy that Michelangelo was doing in a very graphic way that allowed him to understand how the bones and muscles worked. So you see what Michelangelo's doing. He's going back to the classical Greek and Roman world to bring back the physical realities of the human form. But he subordinates that beautiful anatomical truth to a greater spiritual truth. This is where the Christian Renaissance appropriates the Greek and Roman, right? And then turns it into something that's no longer pagan. We go back to the picture of Moses and you see the intensity of the eyes. You see the spiritual purpose. Here is the man. He's got one of the tablets of the Decalogue under his arm, the commandments, right? Here is a man that has been commissioned by God. This is one of the prophets that stood in the presence of God on top of the mountain, right? At one point, Moses actually had to wear a veil when he came down from the mountain after talking with God, because his contact with the Almighty irradiated him. It turned him into a glowing creature that freaked the Israelites out. So he took to wearing a veil. And what do I mean when I say Renaissance? That that commitment to portraying physical realities the way they are, that comes from the Greek and Roman world, with that higher spiritual dimension that you get that supersedes the mere physicality of the statue and shows you the spiritual person of God's primary prophet in the Old Testament. And by the way, if you get a chance to go back and look at the David image, you could make the exact same argument, right? The young shepherd boy who, the minute he takes on God's cause to fight Goliath, the shepherd boy becomes something much greater than a shepherd boy. And you see that in the still boyish, yet incredibly perfected physique of David. And you see it in those two statues.
A fun fact about David is that Michelangelo wasn't actually the first man to be commissioned to make that statue. He was down the line, and it took him and his genius to be able to actually finish it to his liking, although he had to go back and fix a nose. So that's kind of the famous little David tidbit
Yep.
that I like to talk about. But when you look at Moses here, what's so profound to me is the fact that there were supposed to be 40 statues for this tomb for Pope Julius II. And obviously, Michelangelo was a perfectionist when it came to his sculpture. He wanted it to be just right. He didn't care as much about the painting, like you said, but he wanted to make sure that Moses was complete. Moses is the centerpiece. And as you look at the Bible, Moses is a centerpiece moving forward with it. And the profoundness of this sculpture, I don't think any of us would actually understand it unless we were able to stand in front of it in real person to really get a grasp of, whoa, what did this guy do in the 16th century? We take for granted, I think, most of the art that we have because we think, oh, I could do that if I wanted to. But these people are working hundreds and hundreds of years ago when they don't have the tools like we do, and they didn't have that inspiration. It all had to come from within. And it's so much more profound than what we can produce today.
Go back to the picture. You know, painters have it as amazing as painters are. They have it easy, right?
Compared to
color and a canvas.
Exactly.
Right? You're working in 2 dimensions, basically. Can you imagine what was at the time just a huge block of Carrara marble, right? Just a huge, solid but fragile, because not only is marble hard, but when you cut into it and you drill into it and you hammer into it, it flakes and it falls apart. Something that is that hard and solid, and out of a solid block of marble to sculpt something like that in 3 dimensions, it's actually said that Michelangelo would make wax models of his sculptures before he did them, and then he would put the sculpture underwater and begin to raise it a couple of inches at a time. So as the head of the Moses came up out of the water, he would start there in the block and bring more and more of it out of the water and then go ahead backwards and carve it. Staggering accomplishment. And it's also, I think, really fitting to when you point out that it was Pope Julius who was a typical Renaissance pope. He was a warrior, he was a soldier, he was a ladies' man, he was a lot of things besides being the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. He was one of those secular Renaissance popes who gave rise to the Reformation, right? The changing of the church. And it's interesting that Michelangelo was constantly at odds with Julius. Julius was demanding he do things like build his own tomb and then trying everything he could to not do it, right? So it is really fitting that the humanist, not the Pope, wins this, right? Michelangelo wins, not the Pope. Michelangelo was able to carve the statues he wanted, but never did finish the tomb of Julius. And that shows you how the corrupt Renaissance Pope ultimately did not have the last laugh.